Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and today is the 4th anniversary since the Brexit referendum that turned us into the dumbest nation in the G20 and set us on the path to international ridicule. And in this video, I'd like to remind everyone about what the Brexiteers said about the post-referendum future and a little bit about how it's actually panned out. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So Brexit was about many things. But the one platform that all Leave groups campaigned on was, of course, immigration. As such, they knew that the vast majority of people likely to vote Leave could be manipulated into the idea that Britain somehow had too much immigration when we can't even fill the vacancies that we have. A vote for Brexit was a vote to cut immigration, they said. So was it? Well, initially it went down, absolutely, driven not only by, a lack of immigration, but also an increased amount of emigration. Since then, it's gone up, under the Conservative Brexit government, and it's sort of about steady now. It's sort of considered steady. But that's because we still have to let them in because EU rules, cry the Brexiteers. Actually, of course, no, because not only do EU countries get more say on immigration than the Brexiteers would have you believe, as evidenced by the fact that the UK has the lightest regulations on immigration out of all EU countries, not that we're an EU country anymore, but EU immigration has actually reduced as a result of the massive increase in racism since the referendum. They've basically said, do you know what, we don't feel welcome here, we'll just go. The increased immigration that has happened, when you break it down, has been driven from people outside of the EU, which were entirely down to the rules of the individual nation's immigration policy, nothing to do with the EU at all. In fact, rather ironically, the amount of immigration from people whose skin is a little bit darker than Brexiteers are really happy about has massively increased as a direct result of Brexit. And this is because immigration was never out of control. We need more workers. This is why Conservative governments would constantly say, oh, we've got too much immigration, we're going to stamp on it. And then it would increase because they would just say, it's a bit like the immigration rules that Priti Patel is pushing at the moment. Everyone is saying how awful they are. And absolutely, if you implemented those rules, it would be devastating. It's not just a moral issue. It would be devastating to the British economy. But they're not going to. What they're going to do is they'll put those rules through. Sure, they'll pass them. It'll be written into law. And then there'll be a load of exceptions. There'll be exceptions that basically cover everyone. Because the exceptions will say, and they've already talked about this, well, if we really need you, to do work, then you can come in. Well, that's how immigration works anyway. If we need the people to do the work, then they can come in. And if not, well, they can only come in if they've got enough money to sustain themselves. That's how it works right now. But, so the fact of the matter is that, we do need more workers, whether skilled workers, for which there's a shortage of in the UK, or manual workers, for which we still have a shortage of in the UK due to the general lack of fitness in our own population to do these jobs. And when EU citizens started leaving the UK, we had to run campaigns to attract replacements from further afield. The usual Brexiteer thing was, oh, that means those jobs are available for British workers, as if they weren't before. But we've now shown the lie of this a little bit earlier with the coronavirus, because where are all these British workers to pick fruit and veg in the fields? Where? Because that food's rotting right now. It's been rotting for a few months. It's carrying on as, it's peak time now. Still rotting in the fields. Where are they? Next were the promises about having our cake and eating it. So we were going to forge a free trade area larger than the EU. I mean, free trade areas are brilliant, but they're so slow in the EU. We'll show them how to do it. A proud boast when the EU's free trade area doesn't just include most of Europe, but in those 4 years since, now includes the wealthiest countries in Asia and South America. Still, this is what we were promised. So 4 years on, how's that going? We have a few interim trade agreements with some countries, the most notable being Switzerland. We are now refusing to work on a free trade deal with the EU. The US trade deal is being billed as a free trade agreement, but of course it is not. because the American government are demanding that preference be given to goods manufactured in the United States. Japan have just told us that they are only interested in a very basic agreement. More on that tomorrow. Other wealthy nations have basically told us we're quite far down the queue for trade negotiating. But it's worth looking at the EU deal in a little bit more detail because we were told it would be the easiest trade deal in history. We were told that the Norway or Switzerland model would be a great one for Britain. So why didn't we pursue those? Because they lied about the relationships that those countries have with the EU. They tried to make out that Norway and Switzerland have full access to the single market, which they do, but without having to defer to any EU rules, which is most certainly not the case. This is why the idea that the UK would not agree to a comprehensive trade deal with the EU is not a surprise to those of us who knew enough about those relationships to understand what was going on. What the Brexiteers were promising wasn't just built on lies, but was completely contradictory. Because, sometimes a politician promises a policy that you don't believe they'll follow through on. Like Conservative leaders saying that they will invest in the NHS. You know that's a lie because of their past actions and what they've said in the past about the NHS and funding as well. But it's possible for them to do it. They just choose not to. But the trade deal being promised by Brexiteers in 2016 was actually impossible. You don't get access to any market, much less the largest, wealthiest market in the world, without following rules. And people should have known this. You're not even allowed to walk into Tesco without following their rules. Who the bloody hell seriously thought that the wealthiest and most powerful trade bloc in the world were going to give us a special deal that completely undermines the fabric of that market? Because if they did that for us, everyone else asked for it. Japan will ask for it. Japan's wealthier and more populous than we are. They're much larger. Not as large a market further away. But, they would say, well, hang on a minute. Why haven't we got a special deal? Countries within the EU will go, hang on a minute, why haven't we got a special deal? Utter madness. And the Brexiteers accepted that we'd need to weaken their market in order for us to get the deal they proposed. There was no attempt to dispute that at the time. That came later. But they said that the EU needed us too much and that's why they'd give it to us. German car manufacturers would force the German government to back down, they said. How did that go? In fact, where are the calls from EU-based manufacturers anywhere to give in to our ridiculous demands? They've done the opposite. They've actually said, large, powerful manufacturers based in the EU have said, a no-deal Brexit's going to hurt us, but weakening the single market will hurt us more. Don't do it. And what about the easiest trade deal in history? We're 4 years on. We've made no progress towards it at all. I would say, in January, I wouldn't have said no progress because I would have said that we've made some progress in terms of the withdrawal agreement. Slow progress, but that presented some sort of blueprint for a future relationship. So you could argue that was some progress. However, given that Boris Johnson now wants to tear the whole thing up, I think I am justified in now saying we've actually made no progress, simply on the basis that we made a little bit of progress up until January of this year, and then we've made negative progress. So it's net zero progress. Not just less progress than other trade deals that take about 10 years and still get further than we have in 4. We were also promised that EU citizens living and working in the UK would continue to have the same rights after Brexit. That went south badly. Frankly, I feel utterly ashamed of the way that we have treated these people, that our government has at any rate. They said that the Irish border will be unaffected by Brexit, which then turned out to be the biggest block to Brexit of all, and moving the customs border to the Irish Sea, which in theory could have allowed that promise mostly to be kept, has still not really solved the problem because Johnson is failing to put in the infrastructure to keep his word on that issue. They said that we should leave the EU to do away with all the bureaucracy that comes with membership. Oh, there's so much EU red tape. Can't say I experienced any EU bureaucracy myself, but there it is. However, we now know that we're about to get a whole load more. Some people might say, well, it's really for businesses, the bureaucracy for businesses. But those businesses are facing much, much more paperwork. There's been a recruitment drive to hire more bureaucrats to make Brexit work in 2020. And the Financial Times recently pointed out that as a result of this recruitment drive, which may not even be the end of it, the UK will actually have more bureaucrats than the entire EU Commission. Which sort of suggests, particularly as British bureaucrats are considered to be fairly efficient and effective, we actually have had a good reputation on that front. And that sort of suggests that being in the EU reduces bureaucracy. I mean, if we have to hire more bureaucrats to deal with leaving the EU, that means being in the EU was less bureaucratic. Fancy that. It was actually a reasonably efficient way to do business with other countries. We were told Brexit means Brexit, even though this poorly defined word had only just entered the lexicon, and yet what Brexit means has changed at least a dozen times since the referendum and seems to change on an almost monthly basis at the moment. It meant being in the single market, but not following EU rules. One way of looking at it. Ironically, when you look at what the government said most recently, it means not being in the single market, but actually accepting that we will still have to follow some EU rules, even outside it. It used to mean giving an extra 350 million quid a week to the NHS, but now means giving extra money to private companies who may or may not produce something of value to our health service. The latest report says that the NHS COVID app, for example, the one that's just been junked, that we knew was no good back in April, has cost us £11.8 million alone. And every penny of that was utterly wasted, can't be used. And the least said about the failed PPE that passed through Turkey, the better. Speaking of Turkey, we were told that if we don't leave the EU, there's nothing to stop Turkey joining the EU. Nice little bit of casual racism thrown in there by Boris Johnson. And I'll keep reminding people that think they voted for Brexit for non-racist reasons. Look around at who's on your side. Have a little look at that. It's not really the side you want to be standing on. But the very concept only worked on those who lack even a fundamental understanding of the EU. Because we now know, of course, if we didn't then, that actually, if you're in the EU, you do get a say on who joins. If you alone say we don't want that country to join, that country doesn't join. That's all there is to it. Leaving the EU is actually the way to make sure you've got no influence over the process at all. And we know this because when the Brexiteer snowflakes were worried about extending Article 50, they were trying to get nations, individual members of the EU, to veto it. So they understood then, and we all understand now, that a single nation can veto anything on that matter. But there it is. So that's just a little rundown of some of the things that were said about Brexit 4 years ago and how it's panned out now. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.